Good morning. Today we are going to continue with Chapter 16, World War II. Yesterday we started talking about the beginning of the war. Let's go over our key terms real quick before we continue our reading. Who can tell me about the Axis powers? What are the Axis? Who were in the Axis powers? Anybody remember? Big country, Axis power. Sam.
Italy, Germany, and
Starts with J. Japan. So Germany, big country. They were both in the Central Powers in World War I. They're in the Axis powers in World War II. Germany, we know, has Adolf Hitler. So they are the Axis powers. Germany was with Italy, who had Mussolini, and Japan, who was fighting for power and control in the Pacific Ocean. So who were the big allies that the Axis powers were fighting against? Chase.
it was the Great Britain, Soviet Union, and the U.S.
Great Britain, Soviet Union, United States were the big powers. Remember, it's not just those countries fighting. There were a lot of little countries that were taking sides, that were joining the Axis or joining the Allies. So the whole world, almost all the countries in World War II were fighting on one of the sides. The majority of them, as we saw yesterday, were in the Allies, but we could see how the Axis powers were starting to spread. By 1943, they had controlled a lot of area that they had not controlled before. So they were getting a lot bigger, and it was scary thinking that those small countries were overtaking so much area. What is a civilian? Who is a civilian? Ethan.
Person not an active
Yeah. Yep, the civilians are the people not active in the military. They're not fighting in the war, so the people back home. Speaking of home, what is the home front, Paul? Yeah, the area where the civilian activity is happening. So in World War II, the war was not happening on the United States land. So all of our land here in the United States was the home front. So we're going to find out about the Minnesotan home front, what we were doing. What is rationing? Something that happens throughout time. It's happened here in Minnesota in recent times. What is rationing, Adrian? It's limiting the amount of something specific that people want to buy. There's so much demand for it and not enough supply. So you can only buy one or two of something so other people have the opportunity to also buy it. What is the Victory Garden? Who remembers what those Victory Gardens were, Sam?
Public gardens that civilians planted.
Yeah, it's the gardens that the civilians were planting because the food was in a shortage. So the farmers, some of them were going off to war, some of them had lost their farms during the farm crisis and the Great Depression. There wasn't a lot of farms, a lot of produce being sold. So people were growing their own gardens to help get those fruits and vegetables. So we called those Victory Gardens. What is a draft? Chase. Yeah, it's selecting people. It's a selection where you're required to step up and enlist in the military. Thankfully, there's only a few times that we've had to enact the draft. We'll see what happens in World War II with that. So, as we've been doing, make sure you have your comprehension pages out so you can be answering questions as we go. If you answer each section at a time, when we come to correct it, you should be ready to go. So, page 345, the home front. Most Minnesotans spent the war at home in Minnesota. These civilians were not involved in active military duty. They lived their lives as best they could, working, making sacrifices, and worried about loved ones who were off fighting the war. William Cummings and Hildred Long were among the hundreds of thousands of people who spent the war on the Minnesota home front, engaged in non military activities away from the battlefields. So let's find out about two stories from the home front. William Cummings was a restless young man who worked for four employers in the Twin Cities over the course of the war. Cummings and his wife Betty followed the war news and wondered constantly whether he would be called to fight. Another story was that of Hildred Shelland and Frank Long. The couple got married in May of 1942, just 1 month before Frank entered the Army. Hildred Long worked for the New Deal's Farm Security Administration, teaching homemaking skills to women around Detroit Lakes. Later, she took another government job in Ada, about 60 miles away. This time, she worked for the Office of Price Administration, the federal agency that controlled the availability and prices of goods needed by the military and by civilians. Hildred and Frank wrote to each other almost every day they were apart. Their letters provide glimpses of life during World War II. So think about that. Back in the early 1900s, remember most women were homemakers. They stayed in their house, they took care of the house, the cooking, the cleaning, and if they started having kids, they were taking care of the kids. Women were just starting to join the workforce. But now, with World War II being the largest war ever, more men were being called up to join the military. So there were a lot of job openings, and people needed to fill those jobs. So the women weren't just saying, oh, I want to make money, I want to work. They were needed. It was a necessity that they go to work, that they go in there and they fill those openings that were happening because the men were going off to be soldiers. So Hildred was showing how important it was that women stepped up. William Cummings' diary, page 346. William Cummings was in his 20s when World War II broke out. He wrote in his diary daily about events of the war and his life on the home front. December 7th, 1941. Something happened today that I thought would never happen at all. Japan declared war on the United States. It is hard to realize that we are now actually engaged in war. My friend Eugene Larson is a gunner's mate in the U.S. Navy on the Pacific Ocean. So now there's this fear that we have friends and loved ones who are in the military, and now we're actually in the war. So it just got very real. War work. Ever since the war had begun in Europe in 1939, more than 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States had been sending food and weapons to Great Britain and the Soviet Union to help their war effort. U.S. military planners also knew that if America entered the war, the nation would need all sorts of supplies. It would especially need weapons and ammunition for its own soldiers. These planners pushed for a huge increase in the production of war-related supplies. Twin Cities Ordnance in New Brighton was one of more than 200 government-owned weapons factories that opened in the United States between 1940 and 1945. So they were preparing. They were looking to the future. We're not in the war right now, but it's getting bigger and bigger. And we know with World War I, we got pulled into it. We might get pulled into this one, and we need to be ready and prepared. We don't want to have to go to war and not have enough weapons and ammunition. In November of 1941, William Cummings heard that a new ammunition plant in New Brighton was hiring workers. The pay is really good there, he wrote in his diary. Competition for the jobs at Twin Cities Ordnance was fierce. Cummings finally landed a job there inspecting ammunition. It was really interesting to see the bullets form from chunks of metal, he wrote after his first day on the job, and the noise from these machines. One has to shout to be heard. And I do believe Twin Cities Ordnance is still around today. I'm fairly certain it's still in New Brighton. Not 100%, but I've heard of it. So if it's not around right now, it has been in the recent past. Look at the picture there. As more and more men went off to war, many women filled defense jobs. This worker is sorting bullets at the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant. So, like I was saying, more women were having to step up and fill those roles as the men were going off to war. Manufacturing. Many Minnesota companies contributed to the war effort. Some started making different products that the military needed. Others increased production of things that were suddenly in high demand. Munsingwear, a Minneapolis underwear manufacturer, made military clothing. Crown Iron Works, also of Minneapolis, produced portable bridges and pontoon boats. Anderson Corporation, a window manufacturer in Bayport, made huts for the military that could be assembled quickly and easily. Hormel, a meat processing company based in Austin, made millions of cans of Spam luncheon meat to feed soldiers and civilians around the world. So these Minnesota companies were changing what they were actually making. So Anderson is a window company. They're still around today. You can have them put windows into your house. Well, they were making the huts, so they changed the production a little bit to make it suitable for the military. So now they were able to help on the home front. They were able to help the war effort. A lot of these companies just made some changes to their production style so they could help out. The pontoon company, not a lot of people buying pontoons in Minnesota when the war's going on. It's just after the Great Depression. So they're saying, hey, you know what? How can we change and make these pontoon boats for the military to use, for the landing crafts that were going off of the big Navy ships and having to go onto the land? So what can we do to help out? So everybody was doing their part and helping in small ways. William Cummings' diary, War Production, January 27th, 1942. So this is a month after we've joined the war. As I came to work, a long freight train went by. It was all flat cars. Each flat car had 2 new Army trucks on it. This is the first time I had seen anything like that. I know sometimes when we see the military convoys going up to Fort Ripley, you'll see like a whole bunch of Army trucks on the road, and you're like, whoa, what's happening? And it's a little scary at first, the first time you see a big convoy happening, because we don't normally see that here. So that's kind of like what he was seeing on the train. When you see a train go by, usually it's the coal cars coming from the Iron Range. You're not used to seeing all the flat cars with all the military vehicles. And it makes it seem more real. Wow, something has changed. I remember after 9/11, and there were all the fighter jets and military helicopters in the air. And it was just weird that we were seeing this. So it was just out of the ordinary and strange to see all these military vehicles. Agriculture. Minnesota farmers increased production during the war, but a shortage of farm laborers made the work difficult. Many farm men had gone off to war, and thousands of rural men and women had taken high-paying defense jobs in the cities. The U.S. government tried to ease the shortage by excusing farm workers from military service. The state government also urged women, children, and the elderly to help out more with farm work. The shortage was so severe that the U.S. government decided to bring in a new group of people to help with farm production and other needed tasks. German and Italian soldiers who had been captured by the Allies. So prisoners of war, they were now putting to work on the farms. Instead of just housing them in their internment camps, where we just keep the prisoners of war, now we're putting them to work. We're saying, you know what? Instead of just sitting here, you're going to do some work for us. Between 1943 and 1945, several thousand German and Italian prisoners of war lived in camps in Minnesota and were put to work. Sometimes they labored alongside workers who had immigrated to the United States from countries such as Mexico, Jamaica, and Barbados. Iron ore and timber. World War II put new demands on Minnesota's iron ore and timber industries. Many mines on the Iron Range had shut down during the Great Depression. When the United States began preparing for war in 1939, everything changed. Mines on the Mesabi, Vermilion, and Cuyuna ranges resumed full time production. These mines supplied millions of tons of iron ore that was made into guns, tanks, bombs, and ships. Minnesota's timber industry had a hard time keeping up with increased demand for lumber and paper products. In November of 1943, officials estimated that the state needed about 4,000 more loggers. The following year, lumber companies, like farms, began employing prisoners of war, mainly Germans. So, all of these things, like I had said, had shut down during the Great Depression. Now they needed to open back up and they needed to find workers to fill all of those spots. Well, people had started to find jobs elsewhere, so there wasn't a lot of workers. Plus, we had all these people going off being soldiers that we had all kinds of openings. So, one easy solution was to have the prisoners of war fill those jobs. Making sacrifices. In the first few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, life seemed to go on as usual for many Minnesotans. By the spring of 1942, however, things were changing. The U.S. government started a system of rationing to limit the amount of certain items that people could buy. These items were needed for soldiers. Sugar was one of the first foods to be rationed. Some people, like William Cummings, stocked up on sugar before the rationing took effect. Others, including Hildred Long, found they could make do with less. I bought some more sugar tonight, she wrote in a letter to Frank. If I don't begin using it, I will have all my containers full and people will begin accusing me of hoarding. So she didn't want to be one of those people that stockpiled. She wanted to say, hey, I'm just taking what I need, I'm using what I need. In early 1943, the U.S. government announced that the combined armed forces of the United States and the rest of the Allies needed 25% of all the food the nation produced. The government began rationing a wide variety of foods. These included meat, milk, eggs, soups, juices, and almost every kind of canned, dried, or frozen fruit and vegetable. All foods were assigned point values, and each person got a certain number of points. People used government issued stamps printed with different point values to buy ration foods. So let's say you had 10 points on your card and you wanted to buy eggs, that might have been 2 points. Then you want to buy some hamburger, that might be 5 points. So you had to decide, I only have so many points. It's like making a budget. Which food is the most important food that I need, and how much of it can I get while saving points for some of the other food? I don't want to spend all my points on hamburger and then have nothing else to eat. So they needed to really think through what it is that was important that they have to eat. And they had to, when I make my grocery list, it's more of a, we're going to have hamburgers tonight, so I need to get hamburgers and buns and salad to go with the hamburgers. And I think about it that way. They were thinking about it, I only have so many points. So, how much points does each food cost? And I need to decide which of those is most important for me. Paul.
So are those like type of food stamps or something?
No, food stamps are different. Food stamps would be when we talked about during the Great Depression, they had welfare started up. Food stamps would go along with that for people with need who don't have the money. The government helps out. And so they use food stamps to buy food. Again, they have to think about how much, which types of food they're going to buy because they only have so much money to spend in food stamps. But this was for everyone. Food stamps are just for people who needed the extra help. The ration cards were for every single household. You only got so many ration points, and you had to decide how to spend them. Andrea.
Wait, how did government know how many foods she has to give to? Did everyone get the same amount?
It's not food stamps. This is
I
ration
mean
cards.
ration cards.
My guess is, and I don't know for certain, it was per person. So if you have a family of 5, you're going to have more ration points than a single person because you're feeding more people. So my guess is through the census, they knew how many people were in each family, and you got ration points based off of that. Not positive, but it sounds pretty fair because they wouldn't just say, oh, every household gets the same number because every household has a different number of people in it. Many Minnesotans, including Hildred Long, struggled at first with the rationing system. We're to have only 48 points for our canned food rationing, she wrote, with number 2 canned peas counting 16 or 18 points. Other foods accordingly. Fruits more, and soups and baby foods less. It will amount to about a can a week per person. So there you go. She's saying, yep, it's they're figuring it out per person how much you can get. So 1 can of peas a week per person. So if you just have 2 people in your house, you get 2 cans of peas for the whole week. I don't eat canned vegetables. I do more frozen vegetables. So it'd be like a bag of frozen peas. My family can eat a bag in one night. We have a bag of frozen peas with our dinner, but we would only have enough. I have 5 people in my family, so we would have 5 days of vegetables, but there's 7 days in the week. So you're having to really think about how much you're going to eat each night and what you're going to make. So it was a difficult time, and that's why those victory gardens started up because they could only buy so much food, and they're like, but I need my vegetables every day, and I can't get that at the store, so I need to start growing my own. Let's look at the green box. Government regulation during war. During World War II, the U.S. government imposed a system of rationing to control the nation's food supply. In doing so, the government regulated or made rules about economic activity. The goal of this regulation was to assist the war effort and protect national security. By supporting the soldiers' need for food, the government was working to ensure the well being of all people in the country. Another way the government regulated the economy was by making large purchases with certain industries. One Minnesota industry whose profits increased as a result was the iron ore industry. The United States needed iron ore to make ships and planes for war. Because the U.S. government needed thousands of planes and ships, the production of iron ore increased greatly on the Mesabi Range during the war years of the 1940s. This meant lots of jobs and lots of work for people in the area, and plenty of profit for the mining companies. The U.S. government's need for items made from iron ore greatly impacted, in a positive way, the economy on the Iron Range during World War II. So, the Great Depression, everything was shut down. People lost a lot of money. Now, World War II, everything is up and running, and the demand has greatly increased. So, they're able to kind of make up for what they had lost during the Great Depression. More ways to pitch in. In order to make up for the small rations of store bought food, many Americans, even those in cities, began to grow their own fruits and vegetables in what were called victory gardens. Farm families also kept their own gardens going and expanded them when they could. Other consumer goods, such as safety pins, refrigerators, cars, and tires, became hard or impossible to find. Raw materials such as copper, brass, steel, and rubber were being used instead to make military hardware instead of everyday items. The military also needed gasoline to power tanks, trucks, and planes, so it was rationed as well. Instead of driving cars, many Minnesotans walked or relied on public buses, trains, and trolleys. People learned to conserve, reuse, and repair the things they needed. By late 1943, it seemed that everything was in short supply, even the nylon stockings or hose women commonly wore. Hildred Long wrote that it was a tragedy when she discovered a wide run in a perfectly good pair of nylon hose. Across the country, Americans helped pay for the war by buying war bonds, loans of money to the government that it promised to pay back with interest after the war was over. We learned about war bonds during World War One. Paul?
I have one question. When you're getting rations, does that mean that there's a shortage of the food?
Yes. So, because everything is being rationed now, there's a shortage of everything. Like the baby food formula is being rationed right now because there's a shortage of the material needed to make the cans, the plastic covers for the cans, the ingredients that go into the formula. It's all in short supply. So it's being rationed out. Now, in World War II time, everything's in short supply because it's all being used for the war effort. So everything was pretty much in short supply. Across the country, Americans helped pay for, oh, I read that already. Buying war bonds left people with less money to spend, but many, including William Cummings, considered it their patriotic duty. I'm glad to do that little bit toward helping out in the war, he wrote. So I don't have as much money to buy stuff, but I'm doing my part. I'm helping my country fight in the war. So even though I'm not actually doing the fighting, I'm still doing a part to help the war effort. Joining the fight. More than 300,000 Minnesotans, mostly men, but women too, served in the Army Air Forces, the Navy, the Marines, or the Coast Guard during World War II. Many people volunteered. Many men were also drafted by the government to serve in the military. They served in Europe, Africa, the Pacific region, and throughout the United States. Those who served were from every part of the state and from every racial and ethnic background, although most were European American males. Hundreds of Dakota and Ojibwe served in the military, in part because of their respect for military service in Dakota and Ojibwe society. Some aided the war effort as code talkers. Oh, I've seen movies about this. These were American Indians recruited by the Army to create codes in their native languages. The codes, which were difficult or impossible for enemies to understand, were used to communicate battle strategies. So, because over in Europe, people spoke English, people spoke German, they spoke French, they spoke all of those European languages, we found a language that they didn't know. Not many people over in Europe had heard the Ojibwe language or the Dakota language. It's very, very different. French, Italian, Spanish, they're all based as a Romance language. So if you say one word in one language, you kind of know what it means in another language. When I took French in high school and college, and when Mr. Gambino's family starts speaking Italian, sometimes I get an understanding of what they're saying in Italian because it's similar to words in French. The American Indian languages were extremely different. So they had no idea what these codes were that they had created to try to crack them. So it was a really great resource that the military used. An unusual role for people opposed to war. Minnesotans have fought in every U.S. war since the Civil War, but in each case, small numbers of people in the state have refused to fight for moral or religious reasons. The government has often classified these people as conscientious objectors, or COs. For these Americans, their conscience or inner voice tells them to object to war. During World War II, 36 conscientious objectors volunteered to take part in a unique experiment at the University of Minnesota. It was called the Semi Starvation Study. For a full year, researchers tightly controlled how much food the 36 volunteers ate. As the months went by, the conscientious objectors lost much of their weight. Their bodies turned bony, their hair fell out, and their personalities changed. After 9 months, the men started receiving more food and their bodies slowly recovered. The information gathered during the experiment helped scientists better understand what happens to the human body when it is deprived or starved of food. Lessons learned in the semi-starvation study were used to help treat millions of starving European civilians at the end of the war. The sacrifices made by the volunteers helped convince many Minnesotans that it was possible to oppose the war and still serve the nation. What group of people immediately came to mind that would be helped by a study like this? Andrea?
Homeless?
Homeless people? Who during World War II would this truly help, Edward?
Jews or gypsies?
Yeah, the people that were in the concentration camps. Remember all those Jews that were sent to the concentration camps were being starved. And then they're liberated. And if you've seen pictures of them, they're just skin and bones. So this helped them understand how to better help them get back to a healthy life. Yes?
There's a word for when they're like in that state. They're called muscle men.
Oh, I haven't heard that. Interesting. All right, let's finish up on page 353. In 1942, the U.S. military offered new service opportunities for women. Though women weren't allowed to fight in battle, they could now serve in new female military divisions. The Army created the Women Army Corps, the WAC, and the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP. The Navy began a division called the Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, WAVES, and Bosenko, a sophomore at the University of Minnesota, volunteered. She said, "I felt I could do some good in the Army, and it certainly will do me good. Think of the interesting people I'll meet and the places I'll see." African Americans during this time continued to face discrimination in both military and civilian life. Men serving in the military were assigned to segregated or separate units, which were nearly always commanded by European Americans. They were also limited to performing mainly lower skilled jobs. Now, in the movies, what I've seen is there'll be a whole troop of African Americans that are together, or if there's an African American in a mostly European American one, they'll have the job of being like the truck driver or the cook. So they weren't given the higher up jobs. So that was a form of discrimination because some of these African Americans had great skills that we weren't using. Regardless of race, ethnic background, or gender, service members understood that the war was a serious matter with deadly consequences. Minnesotans on the home front understood this too. William Cummings, for one, struggled with mixed feelings about the war. He wanted to help his country win, but he worried about what would happen if he went off to fight. "If I only knew I would come back for sure, I wouldn't mind going so much," he wrote. "But oh, I would hate to die so young." Cummings tried to enlist in December 1943. When he took a physical exam, however, doctors decided he was not healthy enough to join the military because of stomach trouble. He returned home from his physical and told his wife the news. "Betty was so happy when I got home that she laughed and cried," he wrote. So sometimes people weren't allowed to join, and we talked about it in one of our classes yesterday, because their body wouldn't be able to handle being in the war. They weren't allowed to join up. We're going to have to stop there for today. We will continue tomorrow. For my friends at home, we hope you are well, and we will hope to see you soon.